As people get seated, I just want to begin my presentation so that we can all leave not too late. I'm going to just start I'm going to read excerpts out of this essay, and I've summarized the essay in a presentation. So for those of you who haven't yet read it, you can look at this, and for those of you who have read it, this might also be helpful for you to understand it. The insights that evolved with and from Jeffrey Rubinoff's body of sculptural work are the inspiration for this essay. These insights were discussed by Jeffrey Rubinoff and myself over the course of a year and were transcribed collaboratively and finally edited by Mark Daniel Cohen. They were first introduced to the general public at the Jeffrey Rubinoff Sculpture Park inaugural forum in May 2008. After the inaugural forum, it was decided that a subset of these themes should be worked into full-fledged ideas by a collegial group of forum participants with the aim of extending them to a wider audience, which is what we're doing. This essay postulates that we're living at the end of the age of agriculture, meaning at a time when the order of consciousness that evolved agriculture and subsequently evolved as the necessity of it no longer serves an adaptive purpose. This does not mean that upon entering the next age, we will not need agriculture. Ages I will define by the changes in the order of consciousness. However, it is not our main ambition to engage in a historical debate about the end of the age of agriculture. The only purpose of the former contention is to highlight the value of art at this particular time. To do so, I'll draw on my knowledge of history, the science of evolution, and on my own self-reflective insights on the value of art in general. Since I'm not an expert, we held a 2-day critical workshop including Jeffrey Rubinoff, as well as 6 young artists and arts educators who were asked to question, offer alternatives, and extend the premises and conclusions of this essay. Subsequent to the critical workshop, we engaged 2 PhD candidates, one in zoology and one in art history, to contribute to the essay. The former's role was to fact-check my account of the origins of life, and the latter to relate the ideas I've posited to larger issues within art history. The purpose of this essay is to extend and develop the idea that art holds special value at this time. It is hoped that these ideas, artistic or historical, will be deemed to yield useful and interesting questions, consequences, and further insights. The ultimate objective of this joint intellectual effort will be to stimulate artists to seriously address their role in the evolution of human consciousness. So at this point, I'm just going to reread the insight on the end of the age of agriculture. The end of the age of agriculture. The domestication of animals is believed to have begun 13,000 years ago. However, with crop cultivation 9,000 to 10,000 years ago, a large majority of the population was required to be bound to the land. Cultivation leads to the first continuously settled villages and to civilization itself. Security and continuity, rationalized by predictable food production, originated specialized political, civil, religious, and military institutions. Institutionalizing a warrior class was the most dangerous necessity of this social sea change. If the military were not directed outward, it would threaten the stability of non-military institutions. Thus, a constant state of war became inevitable, and indeed, the history of city-states and empires appears to confirm perpetual states of war. The feasibility of escalating war has become absurd with the advent of strategic bombing and nuclear weapons. No military institutions can claim to guarantee security of territory. Moreover, at the end of the age of agriculture, only a minute fraction of the population is required to produce the current surpluses of food, and thus the fundamental assumptions of the age of agriculture, security of territory as a means to secure food production, must be revised to the era of global vulnerability. Okay, and now to the summary of the essay. So for those of you who are perhaps reading the essay for the first time, I will read from chapters 5, 6, and 7. So this, if you're not going to find this in the essay, what I'm going to do is take you through the entire essay in 20 slides. Okay? Jeffrey Rubinoff's definition of art. Art is an act of will in accord with a mature conscience. And the essay is on the inherent value of art at the end of the age of agriculture. This is the overview of the thesis. If artists realize their art as an existential commitment to conscience, they may then rightly claim to constitute a force to balance science in the further evolution of human consciousness. So what the main point of this essay is, it's directed to everyone, but specifically artists, and understand the role of art at this particular time. And I'll get to basically my argument for this. One of the things that I want to say about this argument is that it was intended to be internally logically coherent as much as I could make it, and thus I defined a lot of my own terms. So some of them are conveniently defined to do that, whereas more colloquial or conventional uses of those same terms would probably not yield such a coherent, conveniently coherent structure. But the purpose of this essay, again, was to have some kind of argument for the inherent value of art so that we could coherently understand it and then be able to debate it. So that this is a tool to aid in understanding the argument. So it starts with cognition. Cognition is an emergent property of matter in our universe. Recall Sam Neiman's essay. Key aspect of cognition is the ability of an organism to flexibly apprehend the connection between changing patterns of information and their behavior with the goal of predicting future outcomes beneficial to their survival. In humans, this is termed consciousness. Consciousness. The less immediate the connection between perceived patterns of information and the behavior, the more complex the degree of cognition is required. Humans perceive patterns and behave in ways that serve to help predict a distant future in ways that are beneficial to survival. The advent of agriculture is a good example of that. Conscience. At its extreme, human consciousness can perceive the future value of presently non-beneficial behaviors to itself. In order to perceive this future value, the consciousness must have deeply engaged with the collective memory. The deepest form of behavior in accord with the future survival value is termed conscience. Maturity of consciousness. Maturity is the degree to which consciousness is engaged with the collective memory. One cannot attempt to perceive patterns with survival consequences deep into the future without deep engagement of the collective memory. The greater the maturity, the greater the conscience. Order. Order is conceived as both a noun and a verb. As a noun, it is used in my essay to retrospectively describe the state of being adapted to survive in a competitive environment. As a verb, it is used to describe the strategies and behaviors that promote future survival. Degree of order, it's a relational term. It means the degree of contribution to the future survival value. Highly ordered or a high degree of order means it contributes highly to future survival value. Highly ordered consciousness will thus likely be very mature as well. Maturity meaning you need to be deeply engaged with history and what Rubinoff terms the collective memory. Group consciousness and institutions. Group consciousness is used very specifically within the essay to denote the patterns that result when consciousness of quote-unquote individuals interact within collaborative groups. This pattern is deemed to be stored in the embodied consciousness of individuals. Once stored in many individuals, they become institutionalized and don't rely on specific individuals for their replication or perpetuation. Morality and collaborative groups. An important institution of collaborative groups is morality. They are the institutional principles for regulating individual behavior and membership within collaborative groups. Tribes are collaborative groups with specific institutions that regulate in-group membership based on lineage, real or metaphorical. Tribalism and collaborative groups. Collaborative group denotes a group of individuals exhibiting complementary behavior, and in the essay I gave a variety of examples that symbiotic organisms and multicellular organisms, but we're talking about groups of human beings. The tribe is one of the most important forms of collaborative groups in populations larger than scattered extended family units. It is vital in agricultural societies which can support enormous populations who must live together and compete with other large groups. Tribalism after the bomb. Tribalism provided a basis for the collaborative group cohesion and it is conceived to increase the order, survival value of the group which masters it at its highest level relative to competitor groups. As Sam was saying, there is a group selection argument to be made. This is a nice way of saying larger and more cohesive groups kill, enslave, and displace other groups and then expand some more. With the advent of nuclear weapons, this has become absurd for obvious reasons. The importance of science. Science utilizes analogies to probe the limits of what can be known about the collective memory of the universe. Science provides a highly ordered explanation of human origins. If human consciousness has access to this piece of collective memory, it has great future survival value considering nuclear armaments. Again, see Sam Newman's essay on evolution. Modeled experience and analogy. Science creates intersubjective analogies of experience. Analogies in consciousness are conceived of as abstractions that model and represent the perceived relationships of observable phenomena. These models are easily distributed into group consciousness, which is the locus of morality. Metaphorical consciousness and embodied experience. Highly profound experiences are conceived to be located within individual conscious bodies. To transmit these highly complex experiences to others, metaphors are a useful medium. Metaphors are conceived of as creating relationships or patterns in the mind/body. Metaphors have an intuitive greater result than the sum of their constituent parts. Metaphor and conscience. Metaphors transmit consciousness by using the subconscious mechanisms of intuition. Metaphor is suitable for communicating experiences that are too complex to be modeled analogically. The experience of consciousness of the highest order are also often the most highly complex. Art and metaphor. In order for consciousness to evolve, it must be of higher relative future survival value, in other words, more highly ordered. Ever higher orders of consciousness implies ever more maturity, engagement with the collective memory, which implies a high degree of complexity only suitable for expression as metaphor. Art uses metaphor to transmit such high-order consciousness. Art and the evolution of conscience. Art can address conscience because it uses metaphor to transmit an embodied experience of a high degree of order to a perceiver. Art with the highest evolutionary potential is done with the most mature state of conscience. Consequently, it is only fully perceived by those with a conscience of similar maturity. Conscience and morality. Morality are the essential principles of institutionalized group consciousness to regulate individual behavior. Conscience is the principles by which individual consciousness regulate their own behavior. Individuals here are conceived as having some degree of flexibility in choosing their own unique principles, not absolute flexibility. Will and evolution of mind. Will is individual aware action in accord with conscience. Group consciousness can be evolved through individual acts in accord with a mature conscience because it is derived from the interactions between individual consciousness. So again, group consciousness can be evolved through individual acts in accord with a mature conscience because group consciousness is derived from the interactions between individual consciousness. Evolution of mind, group consciousness, can be affected by strong-willed acts of conscience. Definition of art. Art is an act of will in accord with a mature conscience. End of the age of agriculture. The feasibility of increasing order, future of survival value, through agriculturally amplified tribalism, reached the limit of absurdity with the event of mutually assured nuclear destruction. So again, we've been saying this over and over again. The age of agriculture thus ceased, and tribalism also ceased to serve an adaptive purpose. In order to survive, humans must evolve their group and individual consciousness, their morals, and their conscience. Science and the evolution of consciousness. It is, as argued by Sam and many others, science is added to our collective memory with the concept of evolution, which could displace the current metaphorical tribal cosmology with one grounded in our profound connection to nature on this planet and our evolving history within this universe. However, a science-only solution leaves us spiritually naked in the universe. Science cannot answer questions of the human soul. Art and the evolution of consciousness. Art uses metaphor, which is suitable for the exploration and transmission of highly complex and profound experiences of the human soul. When our soul is necessarily stripped of tribal gods, artists of mature conscience can play a vital role, richly clothing it by navigating into the soul and transmitting the maps, metaphors, into group consciousness. So that sums up the argument. If you read the paper the way that I've written it, I've actually summed up the argument backwards, so it only gets to the conclusion. And I start with the conclusion and work backwards, so you have to kind of wade through a lot of getting to that. But that's the essential argument. So now I'm going to read from the actual essay, and it starts on page 11, question of morality and conscience. And I think it's only 3 or 4 pages, so we should be able to breeze through it. Question of morality and conscience. It is important to stress at the outset that natural selection alone cannot help us make moral decisions. It is important to distinguish between science, which describes our observations of the world, and morality, which describes the way the world ought to be. What will be asserted is that a deeper understanding of evolvable consciousness is useful in making judgments about morality and conscience. As stated in the previous chapter, which I've summarized, Rubinoff argues that art is crucial at the end of the age of agriculture because of several convergent entropic forces. I didn't discuss this, but if people have questions, they can ask. In turn, this essay contends that the potential art has and its ability to reinforce, this essay contends that the potential art has is its ability to reinforce the order of consciousness, i.e. the future survival value. However, to understand this, one must first consider how the concepts of morality and conscience factor into evolvable consciousness. Recalling our previous postulation, the order of consciousness of a group is the result of interactions between behaviors computed by each individual's consciousness. Is the result of the interactions between the behaviors computed by each individual's consciousness. By order, we mean that demonstrated capacity of the complementary behaviors of individuals within a group to promote the survival and reproduction of those individuals. As a necessary byproduct of reproducing the individuals, it is also reproducing the patterns of information that led to the complementary behavior in the first place. In using the word computation, we do not mean mathematical calculation, but the results of the interactions of the patterns of information contained within all the individual's consciousness. The order of consciousness of any particular individual is not bound by the order of the group's consciousness, as individuals are able to choose patterns of information from the collective memory. However, this computed order of group consciousness becomes a backdrop from which individual consciousness is differentiated. Institutionalized rules of complementary behavior are a very important aspect of group consciousness. Certain rules that are considered foundational principles of individual action, individual action, and upon which an entire system of group behavior is built are here termed morals. Stated another way, morals are essential institutional principles for regulating individual behavior within collaborative groups. Morality is the foundational behavior pattern of group consciousness. Conscience, on the other hand, are principles of which the individual is aware and by which individuals deliberately regulate their own behavior. Conscience is determined by internal will, not by external norms. Conscience and morality may or may not overlap depending on the will of the individual. What is the inherent value of art? Within the framework of concepts that have thus far been discussed, art may be understood as the encoding communication of highly complex and ordered consciousness. Through art, a highly complex pattern of information is created in such a way as to produce in the perceiver a direct embodied experience. This does not mean that every experience of art will be the same or necessarily every individual will perceive it at all. It is through art that high degrees of order can be communicated to individual consciousness. Art provides a context of human consciousness suitable to communicating very high degrees of order. So at its best, the art is capable of externalizing highly ordered consciousness. In its reflective capability, this externalized highly ordered consciousness is the engine for the evolution of artistic consciousness itself. Once perceived, this externalized highly ordered consciousness becomes the baseline for further evolution of the perceiver's consciousness as well. In this way, art becomes a powerful vehicle for the evolution of human consciousness. This raises the question of what relation conscience has to art. If we recall, conscience was defined as the principles of which individuals are aware and by which they deliberately regulate their own behavior through internal will. The degree of order of conscience can then be thought of as the maturity of that individual's conscience. The maturity of conscience increases as the greater the artist's access to the collective memory, because at very large scales of analysis, it is hard to know what is ordered without a deep knowledge base. Because conscience, or the internal principles of individual action, is the pinnacle of individual consciousness, the artistic and the perceiver consciousness must recognize in each other a mutually intelligible maturity of conscience. Thus, the potential of art to evolve human consciousness depends on a reasonable match between the maturity of the artistic and perceiver conscience. Art with the highest evolutionary potential is done with the most mature state of conscience. Consequently, it is only fully perceived by those with a conscience of similar maturity. Art is an act of will in accord with a mature conscience, Jeffrey Rubinoff. So we can say that art provides a way of encoding and communicating highly ordered consciousness between individuals of a similar maturity of conscience. So if art is a form of communication, that raises the question of how art relates to language as I have defined it. Recall that language is necessary for the development of evolvable cognition and was defined as the ability to encode, transmit, receive, decode flexible patterns of information. Here I will borrow Rubinoff's insight and suggest the difference lies in the distinction between analogical and metaphorical language. Analogical language creates abstractions that model and represent the perceived relationships of observable phenomena. When used metaphorically, language does not represent, but creates relationships or patterns which are themselves new phenomena. Art is metaphorical language because it does not model reality, but embodies, creates, and evolves its direct perception. Metaphors exist beyond logic in the realm of intuition. They are the basis for truly original thought and are by their nature unique. Metaphors are self-contained truth and they cannot be used as analogies. Dr. Rubinoff. And finally, chapter 7, the value of art at the end of the age of agriculture. Rubinoff has argued that what is required at the end of the age of agriculture is for metaphor and analogy to resonate together. This could be extended to say that the development of consciousness to perceive and integrate both the metaphoric language of art and the analogical language of science. To understand this statement, let us examine more closely within the framework of concepts developed thus far. Science uses language as a tool of analogy in its pursuit of the limits of what can be known about the universe. Let us recall that the definition of matter includes the as yet unknown. The method of science is to construct analogical models to model and represent the perceived relationships of observable phenomena. The history of the universe is the collective memory of the universe. The science of cosmology probes the limits of what we can know of the collective memory. The evolution of life is the collective memory of life on our planet, and it determines what, at any point in history, we are capable of knowing of the collective memory of the universe. Jeffrey Rubinoff. Art pursues the limits of what can be known about highly ordered human consciousness. The method of art is to use metaphorical language to encode and communicate the experience of this deep order. Art is the map of the human soul. Each original piece is proof of the journey. As the artist navigates the unknown, the art adds to the collective memory. The artist's journey on the path of art history takes him to the furthest reaches of his predecessor as his point of departure. The artist who follows that history then possesses the chart for evolution, which he is in turn obliged to extend to his successors. Jeffrey Rubinoff. Now, another important distinction must be made between analogical and metaphorical language, or modeled and experienced reality. Experiences can only be embodied in individual consciousness. They can never exist in group consciousness, whereas models can exist in both individual and group consciousness. If one accepts this, then the premise that the main goal of both art and science is to contribute to the evolution of consciousness, it follows that the analogical and metaphoric language can specialize on different aspects of its development. It is my intuition that analogical language primarily serves to evolve the order of morality, which is the foundational principles for the rules of complementary behavior within group consciousness. Since art, or metaphorical language, targets individual consciousness, it serves to evolve the order of conscience, which contains the foundational principles of action of individual consciousness. Recalling that the order of conscience is termed maturity, the value of art then can be seen as the vehicle for increasing the maturity of human conscience. Evolution of mind results from the dynamic engagement of truth with both analogy and metaphor. Jeffrey Rubinoff. I would argue that survival past the end of the age of agriculture requires highly ordered group consciousness. To do this, novel institutions, techniques, and other tools of consciousness must be evolved. Since group consciousness is derivative of and manifest in the pattern that results from the interactions between the behaviors computed as the product of individual consciousness, increasing the order of group consciousness will require the presence of individuals of extremely highly ordered consciousness. Thus, individuals who are able to influence the order of group consciousness will be those who express their will through their conscience, their most highly ordered principles of action. Rubinoff has stated that art is an act in accord with a mature conscience. If artists realize their art as an existential commitment to conscience, they may rightly claim to constitute a force to balance science and the further evolution of consciousness. Thank you very much. So I have the unique pleasure of facilitating my own essay. What? No, but you're supposed to actually critique me.
Critique it.
If you could, that would be great. We gotta get, it's 40 minutes. So
Okay.
We gotta have up by 6.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to facilitate this section. So we'll start with you, Sam.
So I think I'll start off with a question that I think I could have easily leveled at myself. So what do you think specifically are the problems that we're confronted with at the end of the age of agriculture? And how specifically would art allow us to confront these? I mean, generally, I like the idea that art is a means to kind of approach a mature conscience. But I mean, you envision this as kind of a science, say, tackles specific issues and problems. Do you envision art having something kind of specific about this? Does maturity in conscience have a definite objective nature, or is there?
I think it does. I mean, as I've defined. Okay, let's first of all say that I set this up as a logical construct because we had a group of 6 art history and artists, people come and they wanted to understand Jeffrey Rubinoff's work, and I set this up as my conviction, but also it might be overly harmonious internally. So some of the things are defined in a way that make it easy to understand at the expense of the detail required by the actual concept. But I'll get to your question, which is essentially, how do you actually draw a line around some of these things, and maturity and that kind of thing. I think it's easy for us to understand how science and the understanding and acceptance of science and the concept of evolution, as you've explained it, can lead us to a new understanding of our place in the universe. I mean, the understanding, as Jeff Foss has said, of we've evolved from apes, we've evolved from stardust, we've evolved from whatever the universe started as, so we really share all of that history with the entire universe. Is profoundly different than the isolated concept of being an individual chunk of a soul from somewhere else. I mean, this is a completely different thing. So just getting rid of the sort of tribal gods and the agricultural gods, just that realization in and of itself requires a certain level of maturity, and by maturity I mean engagement with collective memory. You have to actually engage with the science. You can't just say, well, that's science and I don't understand it. That's not really an option. That's an immature, infantile type of position to have with respect to analogy. Now if the universe was this room, analogy might take, we might be able to plumb the depths of analogy in one corner, and there might be different pockets somewhere that could maybe plumb the depths with metaphor, but we're always grasping at the elephant and trying to figure out what it looks like. So science necessarily can't answer, as you said, it's necessarily slow and incomplete. And analogies are necessarily limited. Metaphors can help us, right? So what Jeff Foss was saying was that, what do we do if we're really going to be serious about survival? We have to be the nervous system. I think that's interesting. My feeling is what steers the system is the spirit of the system, is the soul of the system. It's not just the feedback and control mechanisms of the system. So we're not conceiving as spaceship Earth as having a homeostatic, directionless sort of feedback control, hunting for some sort of optimum. We see it as goal-directed evolution of consciousness. So that requires a spirit, and that spirit sets things out of equilibrium, and that disequilibrium moves things forward. To me, I don't know how group consciousness can do that. That's why I located that, and it is somewhat convenient for my argument as well, located that within what I'm terming quote-unquote individual consciousness, which is the consciousness that's embodied in a specific body. That the maturity of that person's soul determines to me the degree of the future survival value of and we can see this. I mean, you can see the great souls that have put themselves out there, and they've really taken huge risks and have moved the rest of us forward. I mean, everyone knows examples of that. And I think that Jeff would probably consider some of those acts in accord with a mature conscious to be acts of art. I'm not going to put words in his mouth, but he can comment if he thinks that's true or false. So to answer your question, I think that the objective nature of this is engagement with the collective memory. I don't think you can escape that. That's the one objective part that I would say, yes, it's not going to hurt us to do that. I think that doing that will be good. The catch with my argument is the last part of it, which is recognizing it, the perceiver and the artist recognizing mutually intelligible maturity. Now that's kind of a catch because, as every artist knows, some people get it and some people don't, and you just, what are you going to do? And so what you can do is engage with this collective conscience. You can develop it. I think that the more people are conscious of it, the more we will start perceiving quality, the more we will start perceiving the order or the adaptive future survival value. But I don't have a particular solution to that. That strikes me as a huge constraint. But I think that the likelihood of a mass, anytime soon, perception of this highly ordered consciousness is unlikely. But nervous systems have hierarchies of things that control things. So, maybe you have a certain chunk of your nervous system that controls the sort of spirit of the thing. So that's how I would conceptualize it.
So, science has really clear criteria for defining, for evaluating objective truth and things that fit or not. And I'm just kind of going to bring up, I think a lot of people have trouble with the notion of similar criteria in art. So, identifying what is mature and what's not mature, I think a lot of people would have trouble with applying any kind of label like that in some absolute sense. So, just one example, a friend of mine got a grant from the Canadian government to fly over the Sky Dome in Toronto and drop 80,000 bags of chips, shredded up chip bags on the Sky Dome, and that was art. And however you interpret that, I don't know that whether there's an objective interpretation or whether there's an objective way of saying that is or that isn't art. I'm just wondering what you think about that in terms of this idea of a mature conscience. Is there a way to actually?
Well,
do you think there's?
I'm not a practicing artist, but I've certainly, been in the position of having to perform, and my feeling is that artists, I was just talking to Vaughn about this, that artists have a history that's longer than civilization. So just as science has a history, and Newton says he's standing on the shoulders of giants, artists have that lineage. So it's not like they're coming from nowhere. So you're judging yourself on the other artists. So it's the artist who's judging this, right? So the artists, and Jenny will touch on this tomorrow, you are responsible to your predecessors to say, okay, well, if I'm playing jazz, what are the people that I look at and say, what standard do I have? If you're playing cello, what are the standard that I have? If I'm doing sculpture, where am I coming from? And that, as apparently Vaughn has mentioned, is 30 to 40,000 years old. Well, that's older, way older than science. That's really old. And so what do scientists do? Well, they look back to their predecessors and they say, sure, it's more systematized, but you still have people that have to validate what you're doing. There's a process for validation. But I say it's not as concrete, okay? But it's not completely random as most people would have you believe. So, it's not something that's easily talked about, but it's certainly, if you look at it from the perspective of that huge history of art existing versus how long civilization exists versus how long science exists, there's got to be something there. But I don't know what you're.
Yeah, we'll take some more questions and then go to the observers.
Yeah. To explicate that a little farther, the act will in accord with mature conscience. I wanted a definition of art that did not define art in any way, shape, or form under that set of conditions. But what it did do is it exposed the idea of a mature consciousness as well as a mature conscience. So you can't have a mature conscience without having a mature consciousness. So the level of awareness and the level of learning that you yourself know becomes the measure of what it is. So the other part of this was the measure that the individual artist has of his own work, which only he knows. But he knows. He knows deep down in his soul. So your friend who's dropping the potato chip bags or whatever he's doing there knows he is the one who will be the ultimate measure of it. And the problem that I had with postmodernism was just feeling that it was totally vacuous. So that in order to have a measure, I needed that 30,000 years. I needed that 30,000 years, and I needed knowledge of that 30,000 years. I needed the experience of that 30,000 years. Then when I could do that, I could say, to myself, by the way, and that's really where it really matters, is, gee, I think this act is in accord with what I know, and I'm still doing it, which means that instead of dismissing it, I did it in spite of what I knew. And in spite of what I know is really the whole body of this knowledge that an artist, I think, really does act on.
I think both those two comments really clarify what the value of art is. I think I like that.
Are there other questions from the table?
I have a question for the participants, I guess. I'm sort of trying to sort through everything I've heard today, which is very interesting. And a lot of it is more concepts and being, and then when we get down to talking about artists, we're back talking more about individuals. And I did wonder if people could comment a bit about the role of leaders and how much they can change the course of evolution, certainly cultural evolution, and impact art. And also, just going back to the first paper, a nervous system doesn't really have any power structure. It's all very much working on energy and coenzymes and particles. So they're two very different thoughts about how a world will go forward. But certainly leaders, I also was thinking a bit today about, if you think of the Taliban, when you're talking about nuclear war ending and the threat over, or maybe nuclear winter, but you have their very spirited leaders, very impassioned, and they're 60 miles from maybe really surprising people. So that whole element of surprise. So I just wondered if someone would like to help me understand better the role of leadership and sort of where we've been talking today about individuals versus group consciousness and processes of evolution.
Does anybody in particular want to answer that?
Well, I can answer the individual versus group thing. One of the more complicated sentences in this thing was my concept of how, and it's not a new concept in at least social theory, is that group consciousness is computed from individual consciousness. However, it also resides in the embodied consciousness of individuals. So there's you need group consciousness to actually have an individual consciousness, but at the same time, there's a degree of will in determining which aspects of that you're going to take and which aspects. So there's a degree of flexibility. Obviously, you couldn't even talk. You didn't have language, which is an aspect of group consciousness. You couldn't even have that without that group, or you couldn't have individuals having any kind of consciousness without language. But the amount of flexibility in rearranging aspects of memes or aspects of group consciousness that we've been talking about is fairly substantial. The permutations that you can use so that to me constitutes will. Sure, you can call it mechanical because there's only 40 quadrillion combinations that you could possibly have of these, but okay, great, that's a limitation. However, I do think that individuals have some degree of ability to be aware of these principles and to choose. And so in that awareness, I believe that constitutes, the awareness and the choice constitutes the kernel of leadership. And then to me, at least as regards to the essay, I conceive of if you develop and act in accord with that very high order of consciousness, you can in effect pull the equation towards order, towards adapted future survival value by the extreme position you hold in the computation. So it's like you pull the average by being so far out. That's how I conceptualized it. It's a sort of an analogy. But that's pretty much all I would have to say.
Anybody else want to respond to that?
What I've tried to do with some of the things that I've outlined is tried to say that leadership comes from example. So if there is an ability to act at that level of consciousness with a mature conscience, that is something that is self-generating. So there have been leaders in the world who have done that. Gandhi, Mandela, we can name leaders who have done that. Those are the ones who themselves, when acting. So there are acts, both politically and in leadership, that are acts of art by my definition. And those people who can act at that particular level are becoming fewer and fewer as we go on. In postmodernism, like I said, I really believe that the world went through a time when it no longer believed it had a future, and when it no longer believed it had a future, then the derivatives of the culture itself had no value. And derivatives are essentially betting on future value. So once you are able to have a false sense of future values or no sense of future values, then anything goes. So it doesn't really matter. So in order to overcome this concept of tribalism, which is essentially where you're going to go back to on those particular issues, means that you have to have another means of measuring somebody like a Gandhi or somebody like Mandela. And so I'm hoping that this measure, the statement that we're making, is that kind of measure that's not just incorporated in art, but is incorporated out there in the world itself. And I think Karun has taken it from this area where I've dealt with it in terms of art, and that's the hope of what we're doing with this type of back and forth, that other people will be able to take that out and take that concept out by example. And it can only be done by example. But we know that when people really do it with that kind of strength and conviction by example, and if they are leaders themselves in the political arena, they really do make that statement. And I think Obama at least has that possibility, okay? Whether he has that strength or whether or not the political system within the United States will even allow him to go. We have that expectation of him. We certainly, I think many people have that expectation of him. Whether he can deliver it or not, I don't know. But the opposite of that is the utter and absolute cynicism that comes from the destruction of a future that's come from all of that wreckage since 1962. So the choices aren't very good, but hopefully that's going to come along from individuals who will act on that particular thing. And I think it's a very important thing that it be identified. So to me, that is an act of art.
I just want to read the last sentence from Karun's paper, and then maybe ask if any of the artists want to respond. I know there are several artists in the room. If artists realize their art as an existential commitment to conscience, they may rightly claim to constitute a force to balance science and the further evolution of consciousness. So I was just curious if any artists want to respond to that or talk about that. No?
Who are artists? Just so we can name and identify them.
Well,
don't put them on the spot.
Okay, I mean, it seems like Karun's putting forth what the role of the artist is, and I wondered if other artists wanted to respond to that.
Go ahead. Do you want to?
It's on here. It's on the screen.
Well, I think I really agree with Jeff in the way that you study history, you study art history, and you see how things evolve. It's just sort of something that happens to you as an artist, and so then you just take off on what it is that you think you can participate in that can kind of add room into that maybe, or you can bring yourself to that. And I think, for me, it's like creating something is a beautiful thing, and beauty is something that's entirely necessary. So, but I guess someone can say, well, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, or whatever, but. Yeah, so you look at all this stuff, and then for me, like just to take a piece of charcoal and apply that to a piece of canvas or paper and make something with virtually nothing, and then have this thing, that appeals to me. So I don't know why, but it just sort of, it has a way of making you feel whole. I don't know what that is. That's what I do.
I could say something about that too, I suppose, being an artist. A performing artist, an interpretive artist, as opposed to a creating artist, I suppose, is a way to put it. I think the hinge word in that sentence, the thesis, is a force to balance. So that if science has become the mode of furthering the evolution of human consciousness, if we now define ourselves as something that has gotten to this point in history, from a beginning that was just mere matter or whatever, is that an answer to who and what we are? It's an answer to what we are. It's not necessarily an answer to who we are. I think that the artist is trying to answer the question of who we are. It's another parallel stream of evolution, and the evolution of the artist is what has mankind been trying to say to itself all along. What is Bach trying to say to the listener? What do these notes mean? What is a sculpture that's essentially a shape trying to evoke or stir up in the mind in the heart of somebody just looking at it, walking around it. That's not quantifiable in the way that Sam was asking, like, how do you quantify what's good art? It's not quantifiable at all, except in the basis of does it answer certain questions? I mean, I think evolution has become the accepted theory because it answers most, if not all, of the questions. It doesn't leave much out. It leaves out a few things, like where did matter come from in the first place? It leaves out, before the Big Bang, what? And it leaves out, in quantum mechanics, what is absolute certainty? Well, in the end, it turns out we don't have absolute certainty. We have statistical certainty. Certain objects behave certain ways, certain bodies behave certain ways, certain organisms live by consuming certain fuels and expelling certain toxins and all the rest. But at some molecular level, we don't, or at some atomic level, there's a mystery. There's a mystery to where is that electron right now? Oh, where is it now? So I think that the artist is a person who says, well, materialism answers one side of the coin of what it is to be a human being. And the artist, in terms of a commitment to conscience, an existential commitment to conscience, is the person that says, if I'm going to contribute to the group consciousness, if I'm going to use my mature individual consciousness to affect the group consciousness, I need to tap into the other stream of evolution, which is humanity becoming aware of itself, which is completely separate from the science that brought us to its awareness, in a way. Does that answer the question?
Very much the same point. I think that art functions to develop and to mature group consciousness in a way that no other human institution does. And if mature conscience depends on mature consciousness. Then collective conscience, mature collective conscience depends on mature collective consciousness. And I think art does show us ourselves, both individually and collectively, in a way that no other human practice does, even religion. And science has turned outward. Even when it looks at human psychology and biology, it's still objective, turned outward. Whereas art is always subjective. I believe not only personally subjective, but collectively subjective. And so that art does necessarily constitute a force to balance science in the evolution of human consciousness. And that artists who can consciously realize their art as an existential commitment to conscience can do that more effectively, more powerfully, more beautifully than artists who don't realize their art as an existential commitment to conscience.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes.
Does anybody else have questions for Koernig?
Yes.
Or questions that pertain specifically to this paper?
1 minute from...
We have 1 minute. Anybody? Anybody want to make a comment, Jeff?
I mean, art is being defined as virtuous here. Art is being defined as virtuous, and this makes me a little uneasy. Perhaps science is being defined as virtuous as well. I mean, if science doesn't find the truth, it's not science. But science, of course, has in many cases failed to find the truth, and it was nevertheless science. At least now we look at it, that wasn't very good. And certainly, it's not as though racists have no artists. I mean, you can define art in such a way that only virtuous art that takes us forward in some sense towards what we consider to be a good objective, will count as art. I mean, we also here talk largely in terms of visual art, but art includes a whole bunch of things. Certainly, when white supremacists get together, they sing folk songs on banjos and guitars. I mean, I've heard the music. They do it. We can say, well, they're not artists, and maybe there's something to that, but I'm not sure what it is. And then some art, I treat, in some ways, novels which describe situations none of us have been through in many cases, but we understand them. You know, so I can read something that comes from a different time and place, and I read that and say, yes, I see what you're at. And it does open my eyes to something. In many ways, it's kind of like a private experiment. It's in many ways much like science. You have a model of a form of life. I may have never been a Benedictine monk or something. I read this story and say, that's what that would have been like. I can recognize the truth in that. So I get to run a sort of experiment in my mind. I say, well, what would life have been like that? So I mean, I'm not sure, and it could be false. I mean, it might be very misleading too. I'm not sure.
I'm not saying yes to art, to Jeff's definition of art.
Yeah.
I'm saying yes to the other thing. I think it's a valorized definition.
Uh-huh.
It's a persuasive definition.
Yeah.
It's the kind of art that he believes we should value more than the other things that we might call art.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay. But it doesn't necessarily exclude, white supremacists playing banjo from being artistic. It just, well, yeah, okay, well, sure.
A marvelous banjo player.
Yeah.
If there is such a thing as a marvelous banjo player.
One of the things that's missing from Karun's presentation that's really important is continuum.
Mm-hmm.
There's no evolution without a continuum. There is no direct, absolute, this goes from here and goes from there. So what we're really talking about is a continuum here. And how an individual, how an artist measures him or herself on that continuum is really the purpose of this particular thing. And so it's self-measuring. And so when it comes to the group, then it becomes group measuring. Where am I on the continuum? Where is this on the continuum? And so when you're measuring, even in the sense of the banjo player, when you're measuring it in terms of your continuum and in terms of where you think the artist's continuum is. You are now saying, which is what this thing subscribes to, is the artist also has a view of his continuum and your continuum. So you as an audience are looking at it from one set of continua, and she, as an artist, is looking at it from another set of continuum. What I'm saying is, and what Karun's contention is that there is a certain level of maturity to these particular actions. He outlines a case in continuum of consciousness from amoeba, from what? Where do you start? From blue-green algae. From blue-green algae in consciousness and the evolution of consciousness. And he sets out a continuum arguing that the continuum of consciousness moves towards higher levels of conscience. And so the higher levels of conscience is a higher level of consciousness. So in measuring those continua on the question of art versus entertainment, any of those particular things, there's going to be the measure of the audience, and in the case of musicians, intervention of the people who are actually interpreting. He will measure the continuum too. He will measure his continuum of his ability to approach this work, as well as Bach's continuum, and even choosing to do Bach. There are probably people he would not choose because he does not regard them on the continuum equal to his continuum. So now he will then go to an audience and assume the continuum of that audience. So that's why it's very, very, very important to look at this in terms of a continuum, not an absolute judgment.
Okay, and with that, we'll conclude. Karun, thank you. Jenny, I know you contributed to the paper, co-wrote it. Thank you very much.
Excellent.